Okay, it's my pleasure to welcome Tim Harris, who's now the CEO of Wesgro. Wesgro is the Western Cape Investment and Trade Investment Corporation. I think that's the agency, is the correct word. Tim has a lot of experience. He is perhaps most famously known as the DA Shadow Minister of Finance in government. Then he moved down to Cape Town. I suspect he was in Cape Town. He moved to national government, provincial government, and now into Wesgro. Tim, we've been busy with a series of lectures on the future of the city. A lot of these lectures are focused on space within the city, heritage, how spaces can exclude people. As an economist, though, there's also a macro story to tell about how cities shape our economy, how they create jobs, how important cities are for a country's prosperity, and perhaps that's been lacking to some extent. So you will be first, and in a month's time we will have Professor Walter Krugel of Northwest University, who's an economic geographer, who will also share with some of these his ideas about the economy and how cities play an important role in it. From your perspective, I think we are looking more towards the political economy and how politics shape the city, and specifically how cities evolve to accommodate different political interests also. Given your experience as and so yeah, I'm very thankful for taking time out to be here. It's a great pleasure for us, and we look forward to. There's about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, but there's going to be questions, I'm sure. So yeah. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Dank je vir die geleentheid. Thank you, Santike. I'm sorry I was late. It's the end result of being a UCT graduate who only used to come here once a year to watch our rugby team getting beaten. So I didn't know the campus that well. I ended up at the School of Economics and I had to walk down. But I gather you were catching up on the course and probably made it just in time to start. So that was an accurate reflection of my recent career, except for the fact that after I left Parliament, which was about a year ago, I went to work in the Mayor's office in the city of Cape Town. So I have not really thought about cities that much at all until the last year, where I've been on this crash course. So a year ago I was an MP. I was actually probably here. I remember campaigning in a few of the residences, trying to get out the vote. But in the back of my mind, I was considering this offer from the mayor in Cape Town to come and help her put the economy on the top of her agenda. So she knows we're going into an election in a year's time, local government election. She's probably going to be looking for another term as mayor, and this is the number one concern of Cape Townians, is the jobs that they're looking for and the jobs that are only going to come from economic growth. And she knew that we had done some good policy work in Parliament, and that might be able to translate into changing the program of action of the city government in Cape Town to get higher growth. So she proposed this to me. She said she'd like me to help rethink the way the government tackles the economy. And you must understand that for a local government, even a metro, it's not really traditionally a core focus area. Metros are meant to be focusing on spatial development that many of you know quite a lot about. They're meant to be focusing on delivering infrastructure and services on the back of that infrastructure. But I think almost all of the metrics show that Cape Town Metro does this basic role as well or better than any other local government in the rest of the country. And we still find ourselves tracking national growth. So even though we do this job really well, we deliver more free basic services to more people who can't pay for them, We deliver a higher quality of service to the average citizen, and generally we run a city where the infrastructure works and where it's easy to live and work. It's not enough. So what else can you do as a mayor to try and get growth going? So I came into her office and I looked around, and it seemed quite strange to me that the economic elements in the city government were quite far from her office. They were sitting out in a department on the periphery of the city, and certainly they didn't reflect this being her major priority. So I said, well, maybe we should change this. And I proposed the creation of a department in her office that we call Trade and Investment. That was going to try and position the city for growth. And it required, the way I saw it, bringing in 3 different functions that were already existing. The one was the research competency, because if you don't understand what's going on in your city, if you don't have your head around the numbers, then you can't track your ability to drive change. So we pulled in the research team, and right now you should look out for a document called the EPIC, which is it's a quarterly municipal level statistical document that I think is the best of its kind in the country by far, and it's produced by our research team that now sits in the Department of Trade and Investment in the Mayor's office. We pulled in the team that manages the relationships with the sector bodies that are funded by the city. One of them is Wesgro, which may explain a little piece of the story that I'm going to tell you later. And Wesgro gets a funding allocation from the city that makes up about 1/3 of its budget. The other 2/3 come from the province. So it's really a city and province joining together to do the investment promotion piece. But the mandate goes further than that. It's also about export promotion, helping our companies export more from the region. And we actually have a mandate for tourism promotion too. So we're also responsible for bringing tourists into the region. And we run the convention bureau and the film promotion office. So it's a lot of mandates in a relatively small agency, but they're all focused on selling what we have in the region. That's the commonality between each of those mandates. But I'll get into Wesgro in a second. This department, part of this department, manages that funding allocation to Wesgro, so thinks about how best to allocate the funding to the body and monitor the delivery for the municipal government. But then we also fund up to, I think it's 12 or 13 sector development agencies that are, we call them SPVs in internal government speak, but they're really sectoral bodies that have been formed to try and drive growth and job creation in particular sectors. So some of the more successful ones are the guys looking at the call center industry and outsourcing space. They're called BPESA, business process outsourcing. Then there's the Green Cape guys who are looking at promoting the green economy. There's the Cape Craft and Design Initiative. There is there are around 12 or 13 bodies like this, and the idea is that government seeds funding to establish this institution, and then they try and use that funding to crowd in private sector funding to get on top of the kind of reform agenda for that particular sector and try and get that sector growing faster. And I think it's really industrial policy at a city and provincial level, and I think it's worked. The important thing, as you know, about industrial policy is you want to, the government needs to be providing a supporting hand to what might happen naturally in an economy if the conditions are right. But then you don't want to just keep pouring money into an institution that isn't able to crowd in private sector funding and crowd in success. So sometimes these bodies don't deliver, and then we cut the funding and walk away and say that was an experiment that didn't work, and we're going to try and spend on something else to try and get sector development going in another sector. So a lot of what the city does, these are not large amounts of money, but I think they do have an outsized impact on the sectors that they operate in. So you have this function in the Mayor's office that manages the funding allocations to Wesgro, to the sector bodies, to something we call the Economic Development Partnership, which is really about providing a space for collaboration across our very complicated system of government. and that's a relatively new entity, and they're feeling their way towards doing helping successful collaboration. But all of this was just going on a year ago in the periphery of the city. Frankly, it wasn't a mayoral priority. I don't even think she knew where the funding was going, or how much funding was going, or what these sector agencies were achieving. So one of the first things I did was start bringing these to her attention and saying, hang on, these are big experiments that we are conducting to try and get growth going, and you don't even know about them as mayors. So let's try and put them into your office and put them as a priority. And then the third part of the Department of Trade and Investment was the team that does development facilitation. And this is really the heart of it. I've kept the best for last. Because the city, if the city is funding Wesgro to kind of sell the region to the world and help our companies export more, we're funding these sector agencies to try and get growth going in particular sectors. What happens if Wesgro brings an investor and then they immediately walk into a wall of red tape set up by the municipality? If they need their planning approval, they can't get their bulk services, they're missing certain licenses, and their electricity supply is dependent on someone sitting in some municipal office somewhere who never gets back to them. Then you're doing a great job selling the province, you're hopefully promoting growth and jobs in the various sectors that you're supporting, but that growth can't happen and those jobs can't be created because the experience of setting up shop in the metro is really difficult. So what was interesting about this is obviously it's a problem that people have tried to solve quite regularly in the city's long history. So I looked around and I saw there were these development facilitation offices all over the place. There was one in housing, there was one in the planning department, there was one in the economic development department. And these are just the sort of legacies of these kinds of initiatives over the years that have tried to cut red tape and provide a sort of one-stop shop for investors. So I said to the mayor, well, people have tried this, but I don't think anyone's ever tried it with your authority, positioning this office in your office, down the corridor from you, acting with your authority. So that's the grand experiment. We've integrated those offices. We've managed to find a guy who's been in the city for 40 years. He's worked in the city. He's the secret weapon, because if an investor has anything they need done, chances are this guy knows who can do it, because he's worked with him over the years right across the city. He began as an engineer, actually, but he's now probably the best investment facilitator that we could hope for in this role. And their job is simply to say, for an investment over a certain size, for a strategic investment, for an investment that's going to create a certain number of jobs, then we'll give you red carpet service. We will hold your hand through the process of setting up your facility and get you operating as soon as possible. So that's what we built over the past year in the mayor's office, and I think so far so good. It's helping us to position economic growth as number one on the mayor's agenda. And we've had some relatively interesting success stories in terms of being able to facilitate investors that Wesgro and the other agencies have brought into the city. Of course, at some point a few months ago, the CEO role at Wesgro came up. And I was on the board of Wesgro because the city gets to put someone on the board. And so I had served there for 8 months. And one of the board members said, well, you've built this team now, why don't you come and help us get Wesgro to the next level? And it was an opportunity I couldn't resist. Primarily, I'm going to say just between us, but I know this is being filmed, so between us and whoever else watches it. For me, at this stage in my career, it's a really big challenge. I mean, Wesgro is 30 years old. It's got a lot of history, and it's not an insignificant budget. But frankly, it's the first time that I've had my own team and my own operation to run. So I thought, if I'm not going to do this now, then when am I going to do it? And the mayor sees this very much as part of achieving her vision. So she gave me her blessing to go. And so far, after a month, it's been quite an extraordinary journey. But again, I'll come back at the end talking about Wesgro itself and what I'm doing as CEO. But let me take an even bigger step back. So that's a long time just to update you on my CV. But I did spend 10 years working in Parliament 5 of them as a Member of Parliament, most of those as the Shadow Minister of Finance. And I wanted to talk about just a kind of cheat sheet for politics, in case any of you have political aspirations. There are a couple of things that, little tricks. And one is, if you're ever in doubt of what to say, talk about education. It's an incredible crowd pleaser. Everybody loves to hear answers involving education. If you want to sound that you understand economics, then you need to use the word reform a lot. And if you want to sound like you're on the cutting edge, then you need to use the word innovation. So there are very few questions in politics that you can't answer with the sentence, our first priority is education, but overall we need more economic reform and a renewed focus on innovation. That sentence answers most questions in politics. But these are cliches for a reason, right? Because they are truisms, in fact. And I think they actually, those three, if I can deal with them one by one, education, reform and innovation, reflect kind of, let me call them mega trends, trends that will define our generation at least, because they are changing the world and our country. And I guess what I'm trying to do at Wesgro and what I'm trying to do in the Mayor's office is position our region to take advantage of these trends. So the first one is education. There's a global skills shortage. But we here at Stellenbosch, which together with UCT and UWC gives us an incredible skills pipeline as a developing city. I know investors that have put up world-class R&D facilities selling all over the world because their cost base is super low. They want to live in this beautiful region and they can access top-level skills from the universities. So they're able to run top-level R&D outfits, tapping into our skills pipeline. Of course, we're quite blessed in this respect because the rest of the country lacks that top level of skills that our universities here produce for us. But what's exciting about that talent pool, as well as staffing those R&D startups across the city, they also reflect what's going on with the choices top students are making globally. So between 2002 and 2013, this is a side effect of, this is why it's good to speak of mine. Just a side effect.
Then can I stop you there? Let's just check if the video camera is that fine. It says light. Is it good?
Light.
Okay. Okay, cool.
So between 2012 and 2013, Harvard Business School's grads, in 2012, 12% of them went and got jobs in Silicon Valley. In 2013, 18% of them did. And in 2012, 35% went to Wall Street, and in 2013, 27% did. So that trend shows how technology, and particularly education around technology, if we can promote that in our region, we can position ourselves to take advantage of this demand for skills that's playing out across the world, really. And of course, given that we all live in this incredible lifestyle region, where lifestyle is where Michael Jordan decided to retire here because he loves the scenery and the wine. That lifestyle is a major priority for entrepreneurs and business owners who increasingly can live anywhere. They're running businesses where it doesn't matter where they live, so they're going to choose lifestyle cities like ours. And then something else which is more anecdotal from me personally, I found that my colleagues, my compatriots and the guys I was at university with are slightly different from generations that came before because many of them prioritize meaning in their work above remuneration. Obviously that's always happened, but I feel like it's more in our generation. And by our generation I also mean people who don't have grey hair and your generation. I think it's becoming more and more important that top people are choosing careers where they're giving up salaries or higher salaries in order to do things that they feel are meaningful. And certainly living in a developing country with the development challenges that we have, there are opportunities abound in Cape Town to and the Cape region to do meaningful work. So I think what's happening with education globally really positions our region, well, Then, in terms of economic reform, that whole agenda that I described, working with the city of Cape Town and the mayor in particular to put economic interests at the top of her agenda, really speaks to the metro. But what we find is that investors certainly don't know that there's a municipal boundary somewhere between here and Table Mountain, and they don't really care. As far as they're concerned, this is the Cape. They think that Stellenbosch is the suburb of Cape Town with the wine and the billionaires, and maybe even that George is the suburb of Cape Town that Ernie Els comes from. And that's the level of thinking. They really disrespect municipal boundaries, and I think we should too. So that was again one of the appeals of moving to Wesgro, where I shifted from a city mandate to a provincial one, is that we can sell this region in the way investors see it, which is as a whole, not as one divided up by, in some cases, relatively meaningless municipal boundaries. There's one other piece of reform work that we were driving in the mayor's office that isn't covered by those three functional areas I described, and that is about where the vision of where we can take this city region over the medium to long term. What is our place in the world as the Cape? And I think there are a couple of very inspiring examples. I like the example of Singapore. I think there, if you might, thank you very much. People often I had the German Consul General in my office today talking about all of the problems with slow growth in South Africa, the problems with his citizens getting visas to visit South Africa, to come and work here. And you could spend a lot of time talking about our problems, but if you want to find a city that had significant problems and overcame them, you could do worse than looking at Singapore, right? I mean, it was a small island with no people, no resources, hostile neighbors, and in the course of a generation, they turned themselves into one of the most wealthy countries on earth. And if you haven't been to Singapore, I strongly recommend it. It's like a policy maker's dream, because actually the rest of us around the world, we tend to make policy and sort of hope that it eventually gets implemented. They don't do a thing in Singapore without implementing it. So it's an incredible test case of how to run a government with some, I mean, they've got these massive constraints, but also clear advantages. Their entire country is a city. That's something that I think Patricia DeLille definitely envies. But the point is, I mean, we could talk for weeks about the example of Singapore. What I really like about their vision is that they see themselves as the place where Southeast Asian companies can come to think about where companies can come to think about their Southeast Asian strategies. And I think that they're really a services hub. I think it's definitely a strong potential future for our region. It's already starting. The mining Indaba is one of the world's biggest mining conference. There isn't any mining in our region really to speak of. So you're finding companies coming here to think about their African mining strategies simply because it's a great place to have a conference and it's easy to get people here and they can come here and do that thinking. Because Singapore's positioned themselves like that for their region, and I think that's definitely a positioning that we can achieve for Cape Town too. But of course we can't talk about ourselves as a services hub unless you can actually reach places from where we are. So the fact that we have 6 flights internationally from Cape Town Airport, almost all of them heading straight up into Europe. We don't have a major direct flight heading west or a major direct flight heading east. That's a problem. We have to solve the number of international direct flights out of Cape Town. And then we have 6 direct flights into the rest of the continent. If we want to be a services hub for Africa, we have to be able to access Africa from our city. So we have to tackle direct flights to the rest of the continent too. And that's a big priority that we started looking at in the city. We've now actually decided to place a dedicated unit at Wesgro just to solve this problem. Because if you think the policy problems that you are tackling are complicated, try one that depends on the national transport policy, that depends on the heavily subsidized national carrier and their strategy, that depends on the individual airports and what their approaches are, the way they manage slots, and those slots are traded between our airlines and other airlines. Somewhere in the confluence of all of these conflicting potentially conflicting policy environments, Cape Town gets 6 direct international flights and 6 direct flights to the rest of the continent. It's an incredibly complex policy area, so we're building a dedicated competency at Wesgro to help us get our heads around it and get more direct flights out of our city, because then I think we can get closer to being a hub for Africa. The last point on reform is that we're trying to make the most out of really self-fulfilling prophecies. If we all go around talking about how bad the national economic picture is, people just aren't going to invest. And it doesn't mean we need to be in denial about the economic realities of South Africa. But certainly, I see my job now and the team's job working on this in the city as being repositioning Cape Town by telling the stories of what's actually going on here. I spoke about that R&D firm that's running a global business from Cape Town. It's called Synexia, run by an Irish entrepreneur. When I met him, he started talking about all of the problems facing South Africa: corruption, unemployment, crime, HIV/AIDS. And then he stopped and he said, not a single one of these has ever affected me. And then he explained why it was possible for him to run his business out of the Cape and for it to be a globally competitive business. People think this doesn't happen. People think if you want to start a business in South Africa or you want to run a big competitive business, you've got to be in Joburg, because Cape Town is about tourism, Stellenbosch is about wine, we're a nice place to relax. Actually, there's some incredible stories of entrepreneurship emerging in our region, but also of massive corporate success. I mean, the largest media company in the world outside of USA and China is Naspers, a Cape Town company run from here. Kimberly-Clark, a huge FMCG company, they've got a plant in Epping that has the record for production globally. And because the head of the region of EMEA, Europe, Middle East and Africa, wants to live in Cape Town, she's put the head office in Cape Town, which means the R&D center needs to be in Cape Town. So Kimberly-Clark runs their R&D from Epping. Atlantis Foundries in Atlantis produces the engine blocks for all of the Mercedes trucks sold worldwide. I mean, this is not Silicon Cape, right? Or this is not sort of entrepreneurs sitting coding in the corner. These are serious production facilities creating thousands of jobs. Hisense, the Chinese company, makes fridges and microwaves in the Cape for export to the rest of Africa. We don't hear these stories. At best, you hear about entrepreneurship. The cool thing is we've got entrepreneurship, but we also have big corporates that show that you can run global businesses from our city. And of course, that leads me to the third truism, the third cliche, which is the one about innovation. And your university in particular has cracked this in a really amazing way. Innovis, the institution that's leading the way on providing spillovers. You've got the guys at the Stellenbosch Innovation District. And Cape Town's come to the party with the design capital last year, and the mandate of the design capital was really cool. It said in the past the city was divided by design, and apartheid socially engineered Cape Town so that people lived in certain areas depending on the color of their skin. And you can actually still see that today, 20 years later, because it really, really worked, apartheid. But the design capital said, how do we use design, which divided the city by design, to bridge those divisions and reshape the cityscape and make a safer, more efficient and inclusive home for all Cape Townians. And I remember talking to the head of the region for Facebook, who was looking at various places where they could set up operations. I gave her the pitch on Cape Town and I spoke about Naspers, and she said, well, actually we know all of these things. We know it's a beautiful city and you've got high rates of entrepreneurship and Naspers is there, but she said, we really like the fact that you're the design capital, because the level that we're at as Facebook, we need design thinking, otherwise we're not going to remain ahead of the game globally. So don't underestimate how important it is for Cape Town and the Cape region and Stellenbosch to be associated with international design. Then of course, if you're a lifestyle city with this beautiful environment that people want to live in, you're essentially making a digital play, right? You're saying if you can start a company anywhere, choose our city. But lifestyle is not enough. You have to solve the connectivity problems too. So the Metro and the City of Cape Town, and this is something that I worked on for the past year with the Mayor, is really trying to tackle that problem of connectivity. Because as you know, globally we have super slow broadband speeds and super high prices relative. So one of the ways that we've done that as a municipality is to roll out what will be the largest open access fiber network in Africa. And the city's taken an interesting approach. It's decided that the city will own and manage that infrastructure, like a road, like the sewage system, like the lighting system. It's owned by the city, but we'll allow ISPs to operate on the back of that infrastructure. And we can fund the initial rollout in part by connecting up government buildings and saving the intercommunication costs between those buildings. So we save tens of millions a year from the money we used to spend on telecom. We now plow that money into running these fiber networks, and there's a huge public spillover of allowing ISPs to provide fiber services to their clients on the back of that infrastructure. The Mayor's also been very keen on something called open data, which you may know about. It's an idea that the data that a city generates is a valuable resource. And for hundreds of years it's gone into archives sitting in the basements of the City of Cape Town, and they are there. They are these intimidating rows of physical paper archives. But actually, if you take that information and you release it to the public, you can do two things. You can boost transparency, you can make your administration more accountable to its citizens, and you can also, that becomes a resource to seed entrepreneurship, because once you have access to those data streams as an entrepreneur, you can build apps that help citizens get from place to place or solve problems that they may have existing in the city. So it's a really hard thing to tackle. I've some of this grey hair, a lot of it comes from the Open Data Project, because you're really trying to change the mindsets of people who've been doing things the same way for generations, to say, actually, this data that you're sitting on maybe would be better used if we just release it, and if we have confidence that if we push it out to people, they're going to put it to good use, and they're not just going to use it to name and shame us. That very short sentence is months of my life sitting down with data activists who make very compelling arguments, and then municipal officials who make equally compelling arguments in the other direction, and trying to get them to find a middle ground. But our big advantage is political leadership, because the Mayor really seized on this as something that she wants to drive. And we've passed the first open data policy in Africa. We've created an open data portal, and we're filling that portal with data as the first step. And eventually we'll get to a world where city data is open by default, and you'll have to close it by supplying reasons, instead of the situation now where you have to supply reasons to open it. It's all about moving us towards becoming more of a digital city. We're also doing simple things like rethinking our digital platforms, the websites, to make them more citizen-centric. The apps we use. Right now, if you go to the City of Cape Town website, it's a long list of departments, and it doesn't recognize the fact that as a citizen you probably need some services and you don't even know where to look within these departments. So it's redesigning our platforms to be citizen-centric. And then lastly, we plow money into things like the Cape IT Initiative and Silicon Cape to try and solve some of the skills problems around the tech industry itself, and to really promote our region as a tech destination. So you might say, well, that's fine, this is an elitist program that's trying to get fast broadband into the homes of the leafy suburbs. It's absolutely not. We've just opened a bandwidth barn, which is an incubator run by the city and the province in Khayelitsha. And frankly, the Mayor's vision of connecting the citizens of Cape Town across the divisions of apartheid is really one which she sees come to life in the fiber rollout. She sees connecting citizens to opportunity digitally as well as through public transport. So it's not a choice between having a digital strategy and tackling the social issues. They're really one and the same thing. And of course, in the digital space, I don't think there's anywhere stronger on the continent than Stellenbosch. So it's another example of why it just simply doesn't make sense for us to respect the municipal boundaries, certainly in terms of trying to position our regions for investment. if those are the three sort of crib words that you could use in politics, it's partly a joke, but it's also really true. I mean, you'd be amazed how far an answer to a tough political question on education, reform and innovation goes. I think my experience in the past year in the city reflects that those are actually trends globally that our region is able to take advantage of to our benefit. But of course, we are sitting here in a context where national growth is below 2%. So this all could just be a lot of hot air unless we as a region somehow do better than that. Or as a country we start to fix our economic problems and get growth going again. And I think I'll get into what we're planning to do at Wesgro to make that happen. But certainly the approach that the mayor's adopted in the city of Cape Town will stand us in good stead. And we have a great amount of momentum here in the region already. We have by far the fastest economic growth on aggregate across the provinces and the lowest unemployment. Unemployment in our region is still too high, but it's 12 percentage points lower than the national average. The tourism industry has been an extraordinary source of job creation and growth. And very recently we heard that Cape Town tourism's visitor numbers in January, February and March were records. They were the highest of any year in history. So we've got because Cape Town's on the map as a tourism city, we're starting to translate that into increased tourism numbers. And in the Stellenbosch CBD and also in the Cape Town CBD, we've managed to prevent the decline in the CBD. And I grew up in Durban, and I think what you've seen happen in Durban is what's happened right across the continent, and in fact many cities around the world, where the central city has been hollowed out and you've had these other CBDs emerging to take the place of the central city, and that represents a significant loss of investment, right? You've got a huge asset base in the center of your city that, if you can protect, preserves a lot of value. And I think we've successfully done it here in Stellenbosch and in the city of Cape Town. What's interesting about the Cape Town approach is that it was done not by government saying we're going to do this ourselves, but it was government sitting down with business owners in the city and creating special ratings areas and saying, within the CBD, we're going to have a vote for a top-up on your rates. You're going to pay an additional surcharge on rates, and that's going to be spent on visible security and on cleanliness. And it's going to be delivered in partnership with the private sector by the city. And it's been an incredible success in the central city, so much so that it's now that approach, the special ratings areas, or SIDs as they're called, have propagated right across the Cape Metro. So I think that's a lesson perhaps for other cities in how important it is to retain that central city and how you might go about doing that. So let me just end by talking about my new job now. I've explained a little bit about how I got to it, but really I find myself looking at an organization that's 30 years old with a mandate that's shifted here and there over those 3 decades. It's a team of about 70 people focused on delivering tourism, trade and investment for the region. And I really want to focus in my term as CEO on 3 things. The one is recognizing that the heart of what Wesgro does is promoting the region. And it might sound obvious here, but you'd be surprised. Wesgro, because we're a 3C entity in terms of the Public Finance Management Act, we don't have the kind of procurement overhead, the regulatory overhead of an ordinary government department. We can move very quickly. We can procure quickly. We have to follow processes, but they're much, much easier to follow than your normal average government department. So that's great for us, and I think it's exactly what you want your agency to. You want it to be able to be responsive. But the downside is when government's looking to incubate new things, we're in a really great place to do that, because they can just give them to us and we can grow these institutions. Like, for example, the Saldanha Bay Industrial Development Zone. There was no structure to house it, so Wesgro housed it. And it's now really taking up way too much of my time as CEO, trying to look after this institution that's now got a life of its own, but essentially I'm still accountable for as the accounting officer of Wesgro. So we've got agreement from government to spin that out and hopefully not treat Wesgro as an incubator for in too many other examples, and really come back down to the promotions mandate that I think we do so well. The second is to focus on Africa. The rest of Africa. People, I find in our region and across South Africa, they still tend to not be aware of just exactly what's going on this continent. But I can tell you it's the greatest opportunity of our generation. The growth rates that you're seeing across the continent are multiples higher than you're seeing in South Africa. And yet, we trade so little with the rest of the continent relative to the countries that we're competing with that we don't access that growth. I can tell you South Africa would be growing a lot faster if we weren't the 10th biggest exporter to Africa. And think about that for a second. We're on this continent, but countries like Italy, like South Korea, export more to our continent than we do, as the only country with a significant manufacturing base on the continent. So really, I'm leading a pivot towards Africa at Wesgro and saying we need to focus on these markets and recognize that this is our competitive advantage. And then the third thing is really turning Wesgro into a place that's perceived as a really great place to work. And that speaks to what I said earlier about people in our generation looking for meaning in their work. I mean, I used to work for Standard Bank. I used to be an investment bank at Standard Bank, and it was great, but I didn't feel like I was doing anything that mattered. I was making a lot of money for the bank, and it didn't mean anything really. So I've never had that problem again since I left banking and went into politics. And now where I am now at Wesgro, we have this really cool public mandate. We're selling the Cape region internationally. I mean, who could do anything cooler than that? So I'm hoping if we can, you're going to see more of me at the graduate fairs here on campus, UCT, Stellenbosch, UWC. I'm hoping to tell the story and say, we can't pay as much as McKinsey or as JP Morgan, but you can wake up every morning and be psyched about what you're going to do every day. So if any of you are looking at finishing up and looking for a new challenge, you need to please give me a call. Because we really could have the top young talent in our region working at Wesgro, and that's the third thing that I want to establish and build at the agency. So I know what it's like living in this country and worrying about the things that you guys worry about policy, about the way our cities are working, about investor confidence and sentiment, and you're well read, you read the papers, you're exposed to the doom and gloom. Maybe your friends and family, or some of them have immigrated. Maybe people are feeling stressed about where this country's going. I can tell you, based on what I've seen in the city government in the past year, based on the incredible focus that the mayor has to achieving all of these things, and that the provincial premier does too, I am confident that not only can South Africa achieve its potential, but that potential can start right here in the Cape. We can start achieving that right here. We can lead South Africa into a high growth environment by getting these things done right here in the Cape. And we can do it despite the national constraints, despite how difficult it is to get visas, and despite the problems with investor confidence. We have enough here in our region to sell to make these things happen. But the problem is, this is not just some kind of Pollyanna-ish vision. It's intensely competitive out there. Other cities are going to build or have education pipelines like UCT and Stellenbosch. They're going to position themselves as educationally excellent. Other cities, Nairobi, Addis, Lagos, Joburg, they're positioning themselves as African hubs. They're going to lead our continent. Other cities will establish innovation districts like Stellenbosch has. They'll embrace the digital city like Patricia de Lille wants to. We are going to face intense competition on all of these fronts. So what that means is that we, in our generation, have to do this now. Our kids aren't going to be able to stand here and talk about positioning Cape Town as a services hub for Africa because the opportunity will be long gone. So that's the call to arms. We can do this. I'm intensely optimistic about our country because of what we can do here, but it's up to us, it's up to this generation. And I'm very glad that you have a class, an interdisciplinary class like this, that helps us think about how to achieve these things. Because if this class doesn't do it, if this generation doesn't do it, then we're going to miss the opportunity. So strength to your arms.